The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar like angry fists, each droplet exploding into 1,000 smaller pieces before sliding down the glass in twisted streams. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke, stale beer, and the kind of tension that made smart people choose different places to spend their Friday nights. The neon Budweiser sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue shadows across the worn wooden floor that had seen more fights than a boxing ring. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at the far end of the bar, her fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey that she hadn't touched in the last 20 minutes. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another patron trying to drown whatever demons had followed her through the door. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple black leather jacket over faded jeans. Nothing about her screamed military. Nothing suggested the years of brutal training that had forged her into one of the Navy's most elite operators. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s named Frank, had stopped trying to make conversation with her an hour ago. She'd answered his questions with polite but clipped responses, the kind that suggested she wanted to be left alone with her thoughts. Frank had been tending bar long enough to recognize someone carrying heavy weight on their shoulders, and he respected the unspoken rule of his establishment. Sometimes people came here not to socialize, but to disappear for a while. What Frank didn't know, what nobody in the bar could have guessed, was that Sarah wasn't just some woman having a rough night. 3 months ago, she'd been Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a Navy SEAL who had completed more classified missions than most people had hot meals. She'd operated in places that didn't exist on official maps, neutralized threats that would never make the evening news, and saved lives in ways that would never earn her public recognition. But all of that felt like a lifetime ago now. The transition back to civilian life had been harder than any mission she'd ever undertaken. The Navy had prepared her for combat, for making split-second decisions under pressure, for operating in hostile environments where a single mistake could mean death. What they hadn't prepared her for was the crushing silence of an empty apartment, the way ordinary sounds could trigger memories of gunfire, or the challenge of explaining 3 years of missing time to potential employers who couldn't be told where she'd really been. Sarah lifted her glass and, finally, took a sip, feeling the whiskey burn its way down her throat. The alcohol did nothing to quiet the restlessness that had been building inside her for weeks. She'd tried therapy, tried meditation, tried every coping mechanism the VA counselors had suggested. But nothing seemed to bridge the gap between who she'd been and who she was supposed to become. The front door of the bar swung open with enough force to rattle the frame, and 5 men stumbled inside like a pack of wolves that had caught an interesting scent. They were clearly military. Sarah could tell from the way they moved, the way they automatically spread out to control the space, the particular brand of arrogance that came from recent combat deployment. Their uniforms were civilian clothes, but everything about their bearing screamed soldiers on leave. The one who seemed to be their leader was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of smile that had probably charmed plenty of women and intimidated plenty of men. His name tag would have read Corporal Jake Hansen if he'd been in uniform, but tonight he was just Jake, celebrating his unit's return from a 6-month deployment in Afghanistan with his 4 closest friends. Behind him came Marcus, the unit's demolitions expert, whose baby face and easy laugh disguised a man who could level a building with surgical precision. Then, there was Rodriguez, the sniper whose steady hands and infinite patience had saved their lives more times than they could count. Thompson, the medic, brought up the rear alongside Davis, their communications specialist who could hack into enemy networks while under fire. They'd been drinking since noon, moving from bar to bar across the city like a conquering army sampling the local offerings. Each establishment had been conquered with stories of their heroism, free drinks from grateful civilians, and the kind of attention that made them feel invincible. Murphy's bar was supposed to be their final stop, the place where they'd cap off their celebration before heading back to base. Jake's eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, cataloging potential threats and opportunities with the automatic assessment of a soldier. The bar was mostly empty, a few old-timers nursing beers in the corner, a couple arguing quietly over by the jukebox, and a lone woman at the end of the bar who looked like she might appreciate some company. "Gentlemen," Jake announced to his squad, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "I think we just found our entertainment for the evening." His gaze had locked onto Sarah, and something primitive in his expression suggested he saw her as more than just potential conversation. She was beautiful in an understated way that appealed to his particular tastes, and the fact that she was sitting alone made her seem approachable. What Jake couldn't see, what none of them could recognize, was the coiled tension in her posture that spoke of training far beyond anything they'd experienced. Sarah felt their attention like heat from a fire, but she kept her eyes fixed on her glass. She'd dealt with drunk soldiers before, both during her service and in the months since. Most of the time, a cold shoulder and a few sharp words were enough to send them looking for easier targets. She had no interest in playing the role of conquered territory for a group of men who thought their service entitled them to whatever they wanted. The 5 men approached the bar with the swagger of conquering heroes, their voices growing louder with each step. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle that effectively blocked Sarah's path to the door, though whether this was intentional or just military habit was unclear. Jake positioned himself directly next to her, close enough that she could smell the mixture of alcohol and aftershave that clung to him like a cloud. "Evening, beautiful," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of easy confidence that had worked on dozens of women in dozens of bars. "Mind if we join you? You look like you could use some company." Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a directness that should have warned him he was dealing with someone different. There was something in her gaze that went deeper than simple annoyance, a coldness that spoke of experience with violence that most people never encountered. "Actually, I was enjoying the quiet," she replied, her voice level and controlled. "Thanks anyway." Jake's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his expression. He wasn't used to being dismissed so casually, especially not by women who should have been impressed by his obvious military bearing. His friends had moved closer, forming a tighter circle around Sarah's position at the bar. What had started as simple attraction was beginning to evolve into something more predatory. "Come on, don't be like that," Marcus chimed in, his boyish face stretched into what he probably thought was a charming grin. "We're heroes, defending your freedom, and all that. Least you could do is let us buy you a drink." The words carried an undertone of entitlement that made Sarah's jaw tighten. She'd heard variations of this speech countless times during her own service, usually from men who thought their uniform gave them license to take whatever they wanted. The irony that she'd served longer and in more dangerous positions than any of them would have been amusing if the situation weren't so familiar. "I've got a drink," Sarah said, gesturing to her untouched whiskey. "And I've got company myself. Thanks for the offer, but I'm good." Frank the bartender had been watching the interaction with growing concern. He'd seen this play out before, and it rarely ended well when drunk soldiers decided they weren't going to take no for an answer. His hand moved toward the baseball bat he kept under the register, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. Jake's expression hardened slightly, the smile becoming more forced. His squad had spread out further, and Sarah realized with professional detachment that they were unconsciously employing basic containment tactics. Whether they intended to or not, they were treating her like a target to be secured rather than a person to be respected. "Look, sweetheart," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "we've been overseas fighting for your freedom. Least you could do is show a little appreciation. We're not asking for much, just some friendly conversation." The use of sweetheart was like a match being struck in Sarah's mind. She'd heard that particular tone of condescension from drill instructors, from enemy combatants, from men who thought they could intimidate her with size and aggression. What they didn't understand was that she'd been forged in fires they couldn't imagine, tested in ways that made their deployment look like a vacation. "I appreciate your service," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm despite the tension building in her muscles. "But I'm not interested in conversation. Have a good evening, gentlemen." She started to stand, but Jake's hand shot out to rest on her shoulder, not quite forceful enough to be assault, but firm enough to make his intentions clear. The contact sent a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah's system, every instinct she'd developed over years of combat training suddenly, screaming warnings. "Easy there," Jake said, his voice now carrying an unmistakable threat. "Night's still young. No need to run off when we're just getting acquainted." Sarah looked down at his hand on her shoulder, then back up to meet his eyes. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the air around them. The other patrons seemed to sense it too. Conversations died, heads turned, and the atmosphere in the bar became charged with the kind of electricity that preceded violent storms. "Remove your hand," Sarah said quietly, her words carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to their volume. Jake laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor. His grip tightened slightly, fingers digging into the leather of her jacket. Around them, his squad moved closer, sensing their leader's growing aggression and responding with pack mentality that overrode whatever individual judgment they might have possessed. Or what? Jake challenged, his face now close enough to hers that she could count the bloodshot veins in his eyes. You'll call for help? Look around, princess. It's just us and a bunch of old men who aren't going to get involved. Maybe it's time you learn some manners. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Frank's hand tightened on his baseball bat, but he could see that he was outnumbered 5-1, and these weren't ordinary drunk customers. They moved like soldiers, which meant they knew how to hurt people efficiently. Sarah remained perfectly still for a moment that stretched out like the pause between lightning and thunder. Then, with a movement so sudden and precise that it seemed to violate the laws of physics, she acted. Her right hand came up in a perfect arc, striking Jake's wrist at the exact pressure point that would cause his grip to release involuntarily. Before he could react to the sudden pain shooting up his arm, her left elbow drove backward into his solar plexus with enough force to double him over and send him stumbling backward into Marcus. The whole sequence had taken perhaps 2 seconds, but it had been executed with such professional precision that the 4 remaining soldiers found themselves staring at their leader gasping for breath on the floor while trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Rodriguez was the first to recover, his sniper's instincts kicking in as he lunged forward with his arms spread wide, intending to grab Sarah in a bear hug that would pin her arms and allow the others to overwhelm her. What he got instead was a lesson in physics that he would remember for the rest of his life. Sarah dropped into a low crouch just as Rodriguez reached for her, his momentum carrying him over her crouched form. She straightened explosively, her shoulder driving into his midsection like a battering ram while her hands grabbed his belt and shirt. The combination of his forward motion and her upward thrust launched him over the bar in a perfect judo throw that sent him crashing into the shelves of liquor behind Frank. Bottles exploded in a cascade of glass and alcohol, the sound like a symphony of destruction that seemed to unlock the violence that had been building in the room. Thompson and Davis charged from opposite sides, their military training telling them to coordinate their attack and prevent her from focusing on a single opponent. They had been taught to fight as a team, to overwhelm enemies through superior numbers and coordinated tactics. What they hadn't been taught was how to fight someone whose training encompassed not just combat, but the kind of specialized warfare that existed in the shadows between countries, where the rules of engagement were written in blood and survival depended on skills that went far beyond ordinary military preparation. Sarah's mind shifted into the operational mode that had kept her alive through dozens of missions behind enemy lines. Time seemed to slow as her enhanced situational awareness cataloged every detail of the approaching threat. Thompson coming from her left, slightly favoring his right leg from an old injury. Davis approaching from her right with his fists raised in a boxer's stance that revealed formal training but limited practical application. She feinted left toward Thompson, causing him to commit to an intercept course, then pivoted right with liquid grace. Her right foot swept Davis's legs out from under him while her left hand deflected Thompson's punch, and her right elbow found the nerve cluster just below his ear. Davis hit the floor hard enough to rattle the entire building, while Thompson crumpled like a marionette with cut strings. Marcus had finally helped Jake back to his feet, and both men were now staring at Sarah with expressions that had moved far beyond anger into genuine fear. In the space of 30 seconds, she had systematically dismantled 3 trained soldiers with a combination of speed, precision, and violence that belonged in a different category from anything they'd experienced. Jake wiped blood from his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue during the fall, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. For the first time since entering the bar, he was truly seeing her, not as a potential conquest or an easy target, but as something far more dangerous than he'd imagined possible. "What the hell are you?" he gasped, his voice carrying a mixture of pain and dawning realization. Sarah straightened slowly, her breathing barely elevated despite the violent exertion of the last half-minute. Her leather jacket had barely moved out of place, and her expression remained as calm as if she'd been discussing the weather rather than systematically dismantling 5 trained soldiers. "Someone who asked nicely to be left alone," she replied, her voice carrying the same level tone she'd maintained throughout the encounter. Around the bar, the other patrons sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. Frank stood frozen behind the bar, his baseball bat hanging forgotten in his hand as he stared at the destruction of his liquor shelves and the groaning soldiers scattered across his floor. Rodriguez was pulling himself out of the wreckage behind the bar, glass crunching under his movements as he tried to determine whether any of his bones were broken. Thompson was sitting on the floor with his back against a bar stool, his head in his hands as he fought off the disorientation that came with having his nervous system temporarily shut down by a precisely placed strike. Davis remained flat on his back, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone whose world had just been fundamentally altered. The confidence that came from military training and combat deployment had been replaced by the humbling realization that there were levels of skill and violence that existed far beyond anything he'd imagined. Marcus helped Jake stand fully upright, both men now maintaining a respectful distance from Sarah as they tried to reassess the situation. The pack mentality that had driven their initial aggression had been replaced by the survival instincts that kept soldiers alive in combat zones. The recognition that they were facing a superior opponent who could end them if she chose to. Jake's mind raced as he tried to piece together the clues he'd missed. The way she sat with her back to the wall, maintaining clear sight lines to all entrances. The controlled stillness that he'd mistaken for nervousness. The precise, economical movements that spoke of training far beyond anything the regular military provided. Navy SEAL, he said suddenly, the words coming out like a revelation that explained everything and nothing at the same time. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A brief acknowledgement that confirmed his guess, while simultaneously warning him that the knowledge didn't make him any safer. She corrected quietly. Now I'm just someone trying to drink in peace. The distinction was important in ways that Jake was only beginning to understand. Active duty SEALs operated under rules of engagement and military law that constrained their actions. Former SEALs who felt threatened in civilian settings operated under much more flexible guidelines. And the legal system tended to be very understanding when highly trained veterans defended themselves against multiple attackers. Marcus was helping Rodriguez climb over the bar, the sniper moving gingerly as he assessed the damage to his body. His military uniform would have been soaked with alcohol and covered in glass, but his civilian clothes had provided some protection. Still, he moved like a man who had been introduced to gravity in a very personal way. We should go, Marcus said quietly, his usual joviality replaced by the kind of sober assessment that came from recognizing a tactical disaster when he saw one. Jake nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off Sarah. His squad was defeated, his own reputation was in ruins, and he was beginning to understand that they were lucky to be alive. The woman sitting calmly at the bar could have killed any or all of them if she'd chosen to, and the restraint she'd shown was a gift they didn't deserve. Yeah, Jake agreed, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose worldview had just been violently readjusted. We should definitely go. The 5 soldiers began their retreat from Murphy's bar, moving with the careful dignity of men who knew they'd been thoroughly outclassed but were trying to salvage what remained of their pride. As they helped each other toward the door, Jake paused and looked back at Sarah one last time. For what it's worth, he said, his voice carrying genuine respect for the first time since he'd entered the bar. Thank you for your service. Sarah nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that carried layers of meaning neither of them would fully explore. Then, the door closed behind them, leaving her alone with Frank, the other patrons, and the scattered debris of what had been a very brief but very decisive confrontation. Frank slowly set down his baseball bat and looked at the destruction behind his bar, then at Sarah, then back at the destruction. After a moment, he reached for a bottle of his best whiskey, one that had somehow survived Rodriguez's impromptu flight, and poured 2 generous glasses. On the house, he said, sliding one across to Sarah. Anyone who can do that without spilling their original drink deserves better than the house whiskey. Sarah looked down and realized that her first glass sat exactly where she'd left it, completely untouched despite the violence that had erupted around it. She smiled for the first time all evening, a real smile that transformed her face and reminded Frank that underneath all that deadly competence was still a woman who'd been trying to have a quiet drink after a difficult day. Thank you, she said, accepting the better whiskey. Though I should probably pay for the damages to your shelves. Frank waved dismissively as he began cleaning up the glass. Insurance will cover it. Besides, those boys needed a lesson in manners. You just gave it to them more efficiently than anyone else could have. As Sarah sipped her whiskey and watched Frank clean up, she felt something inside her chest loosen slightly. For months, she'd been struggling with the question of who she was supposed to be now that her military career was over. Tonight had reminded her that some things didn't change just because you took off the uniform. She was still Sarah Mitchell, still someone who stood up to bullies, still someone who protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The skills that had made her an effective SEAL weren't just tools of war. They were part of who she was. And maybe that wasn't something she needed to leave behind. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, but inside Murphy's bar, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to peaceful. Frank hummed quietly as he worked. The other patrons gradually returned to their conversations. And Sarah sat at the end of the bar, finally, understanding that the transition from military to civilian life didn't mean becoming someone completely different. It just meant finding new ways to be herself. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Sarah's apartment, casting long shadows across the sparse furniture that marked her as someone still figuring out how to live a normal life. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, staring at the local newspaper's front page without really seeing the words. 3 days had passed since the incident at Murphy's bar, and she'd expected the story to fade into memory like so many other confrontations from her past. Instead, she'd woken to find her phone buzzing with missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and a voicemail from someone claiming to be a local news reporter. The story had somehow leaked, though she couldn't imagine how. Frank had seemed like the type to keep bar business at the bar, and the 5 soldiers certainly had no incentive to publicize their humiliation. The knock on her door came at exactly 9 o'clock, firm and purposeful in a way that immediately put her on alert. Sarah approached the door with the automatic caution of someone trained to expect threats, checking the peephole before deciding whether to answer. What she saw on the other side made her pause in confusion. 2 men in expensive suits stood in her hallway, their posture and bearing screaming federal agents even though they carried no visible identification. The older of the 2 was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in difficult places doing difficult things. His companion was younger, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and the intense focus of someone who took his job very seriously. Sarah opened the door but left the chain in place, creating just enough space to speak while maintaining a defensive position. Years of training had taught her that unexpected visitors were rarely good news, especially when they looked like they belonged to acronym agencies. Ms. Mitchell, the older man said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders that were never questioned. My name is Director James Harrison, and this is Agent David Chun. We're with a government agency that would prefer not to be named. We'd like to speak with you about what happened at Murphy's bar. Sarah studied their faces, looking for the tells that would indicate whether they were legitimate federal agents or something more dangerous. Harrison's eyes held the steady confidence of someone comfortable with power, while Chin's gaze was sharper, more analytical, the look of someone who gathered intelligence for a living. I'm not interested in talking to reporters, Sarah said, her voice carrying the same level tone she'd maintained throughout the bar confrontation. Harrison smiled slightly, the expression more professional than warm. We're not reporters, Ms. Mitchell, and this conversation would be better conducted inside, away from neighbors who might be curious about why federal agents are visiting a decorated former Navy SEAL. The mention of her military record confirmed that these weren't ordinary investigators. Sarah's service history was classified at levels that required serious clearance to access, which meant these men represented organizations that operated in the same shadows where she'd spent 3 years of her life. After a moment's consideration, Sarah released the chain and stepped back to allow them entry. Her apartment was spartanly furnished, a couch, a coffee table, a television that looked like it had been purchased from a thrift store. The only personal touches were a few books on the shelves and a single framed photograph of her SEAL team taken after a successful mission that officially never happened. Harrison's eyes took in the apartment's details with professional interest while Chun positioned himself near the window, maintaining sight lines to the street below. Their movements were subtle but coordinated, suggesting they'd worked together long enough to function as a seamless unit. Impressive display at Murphy's bar, Harrison said, settling onto the couch without waiting for an invitation. 5 trained soldiers neutralized in under 30 seconds, minimal collateral damage, no serious injuries despite the fact that you could have easily killed any or all of them. Sarah remained standing, her arms crossed as she studied these uninvited guests. They were drunk and sloppy. If they'd been sober, it might have taken 45 seconds. Chin smiled at her response, though he continued watching the street below. According to witnesses, you moved like someone with training far beyond what the Navy provides to standard SEAL teams. The kind of training that suggests black ops experience, deep cover operations, the sort of missions that don't appear in official records. The observation was accurate enough to be concerning. Sarah's last 18 months of active duty had involved assignments that existed in the gray areas between military operations and intelligence work, conducting missions that would be disavowed by any official source if they were ever exposed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what they were talking about. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. 3 months ago, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell officially completed her naval service and transitioned to civilian life. What the official records don't show is that Lieutenant Mitchell's last assignment involved deep cover infiltration of a terrorist cell operating out of Somalia, where she spent 6 months gathering intelligence that prevented 3 separate attacks on American interests in East Africa. The specific details of her final mission weren't supposed to exist anywhere that civilian agencies could access them. The fact that Harrison knew about Somalia meant these men represented an organization with connections at the highest levels of military intelligence. "That's an interesting story," Sarah said. "But I'm not sure why you're telling it to me." Chun turned from the window, his analytical gaze focusing on Sarah with laser intensity. "Because we've been watching you for the last 3 months, Ms. Mitchell. We know about the nightmares, the difficulty adjusting to civilian life, the feeling that your skills are being wasted on normal employment opportunities. We know because we've seen it before in people with your particular background." The admission that they'd been conducting surveillance on her should have been alarming, but Sarah found it oddly reassuring. If these men wanted to harm her, they wouldn't have announced their presence so openly. They wanted something from her, which meant she had leverage in whatever conversation they were building toward. What kind of organization watches retired military personnel without their knowledge? Sarah asked. Harrison's smile became more genuine this time. The kind that recruits retired military personnel who might be interested in continuing their service to their country in a less official capacity. The offer hung in the air like smoke, its implications both tempting and terrifying. Sarah had spent 3 months trying to convince herself that she wanted a normal life, a predictable existence free from the constant danger and stress that had defined her military career. But the incident at Murphy's Bar had reminded her how alive she felt when her training was fully engaged, how much she missed the clarity that came from operating at the edge of her capabilities. "I'm retired," Sarah said, though the words lacked conviction even as she spoke them. Shin moved away from the window, pulling a tablet from his briefcase and placing it on the coffee table where Sarah could see the screen. The display showed a map of Eastern Europe, with several locations marked in red and accompanied by detailed intelligence reports. 3 weeks ago, a shipment of advanced military hardware disappeared from a NATO facility in Poland, Shin explained. Satellite imagery suggests the theft was an inside job, but the hardware has vanished without a trace. Traditional intelligence assets have been unable to penetrate the network responsible for the theft. Sarah glanced at the map despite herself, her mind automatically beginning to analyze the tactical situation presented by the intelligence reports. The missing hardware included components for advanced missile guidance systems, the kind of technology that could turn conventional weapons into precision instruments of mass destruction. "The thieves aren't ordinary criminals," Harrison continued. "They're a group of former military operators from various nations, united by ideology and funded by parties unknown. They call themselves the Prometheus Group, and they specialize in acquiring advanced military technology for sale to the highest bidder." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the description was familiar. She'd encountered similar organizations during her Black Ops assignments, groups of skilled operators who'd gone rogue, using their training and connections to profit from the chaos they helped create. "Sounds like a job for official agencies," Sarah said. CIA, Defense Intelligence, one of the other acronym organizations. Chin shook his head, his expression grim. "The Prometheus Group has connections inside multiple intelligence agencies. Every official approach has been compromised before it could gain traction. We need someone who doesn't exist in any official capacity, someone with the skills to operate independently and the motivation to see the mission through." Sarah studied the intelligence reports more carefully, her professional instincts engaging despite her determination to remain uninvolved. The missing technology could shift the balance of power in several ongoing conflicts, and, in the wrong hands, it would make terrorist attacks far more devastating than anything the world had seen. "What makes you think I'm interested?" Sarah asked, though she was already beginning to calculate the logistics of infiltrating an organization of trained operators. Harrison stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. Because 3 months ago, you were one of the best covert operators in the world, and yesterday you took apart 5 soldiers without breaking a sweat or spilling your drink. Because normal life is killing you slowly, and you know it. The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Sarah had been trying to convince herself that she could be satisfied with civilian employment, but every day felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. She was a precision instrument trying to function in a world that had no use for her particular set of skills. And if I say no? Sarah asked. Chen closed the tablet and returned it to his briefcase. Then, we thank you for your time, walk out that door, and never contact you again. You go back to your civilian life. And the Prometheus Group continues operating until they sell enough advanced weaponry to start a war. The choice was presented without pressure or manipulation, which somehow made it more compelling than any amount of patriotic rhetoric or financial incentives could have been. Sarah appreciated the respect for her autonomy, even as she recognized it as a sophisticated recruitment technique. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Sarah heard herself ask, and realized she'd already made her decision. Harrison's smile suggested he'd known she would accept before she'd known it herself. The Prometheus Group is planning to auction the stolen technology in 6 weeks. Our intelligence suggests they're using a compound in the mountains of Montenegro as their base of operations. You'd have 4 weeks to infiltrate their organization and gather enough intelligence for us to shut them down. 6 weeks wasn't much time to plan and execute an operation against trained operators, but Sarah had worked with shorter timelines before. The real challenge would be getting inside an organization that was specifically designed to resist penetration by intelligence assets. What's my cover identity? Sarah asked, fully committed now to whatever they were proposing. Chun reopened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder filled with documents, photographs, and background materials. Meet Elena Kozlov, former Spetsnaz operator turned freelance military contractor. She's got the right background to attract the Prometheus Group's attention and the skills to back up her reputation. Sarah opened the folder and began reviewing the fabricated identity. Elena Kozlov's background was a masterpiece of intelligence craft, detailed enough to withstand serious scrutiny, but flexible enough to allow for improvisation as circumstances required. The woman in the photographs looked enough like Sarah to make physical resemblance believable after some cosmetic modifications. How do I make contact with the Prometheus Group? Sarah asked, studying Elena's service record and psychological profile. Harrison moved to the window, looking out at the street below with the automatic caution of someone who'd spent decades in hostile territory. We've arranged for Elena to receive an invitation to participate in an arms-dealing conference in Prague. The Prometheus Group will be shopping for additional talent, and Elena's reputation will make her an attractive candidate. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to penetrate their security from the outside, Sarah would position herself as someone they wanted to recruit. It was the same technique she'd used during her infiltration of the Somali terrorist cell, and she understood why these men had identified her as the right person for the mission. What kind of support structure will I have? Sarah asked, continuing to read through Elena's background materials. Chun handed her a secure satellite phone and a small device that looked like an ordinary fitness tracker. Limited contact with handlers. This isn't an official operation, so we can't provide the usual backup. The phone is encrypted and untraceable, but use it sparingly. The tracker will monitor your vital signs and location, but only for emergency extraction. The minimal support structure confirmed what Sarah had already suspected. This was a deep cover assignment with all the risks that implied. If things went wrong, she'd be on her own in a hostile environment surrounded by people trained to kill efficiently. What's my operational objective? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Harrison turned back from the window, his expression carrying the weight of someone who'd sent operatives into impossible situations before. Primary objective is intelligence gathering, locations, personnel, operational procedures, anything that will allow us to shut down the Prometheus Group permanently. Secondary objective is recovery of the stolen technology, if possible. Sarah closed the folder, having absorbed enough of Elena Kozlov's background to begin thinking like her fictional identity. The transition from Sarah Mitchell to Elena Kozlov would require more than just cosmetic changes. She'd need to embody the psychology of someone who'd chosen profit over patriotism, someone willing to sell advanced weapons to the highest bidder. When do I leave? Sarah asked. Chun checked his watch, a gesture that seemed purely habitual. Elena has a flight to Prague tomorrow evening. That gives you 24 hours to complete the physical transformation and finalize your psychological preparation. The tight timeline was intentional, Sarah realized. The longer she had to think about the mission, the more time she'd have to second-guess her decision or identify potential problems with the plan. Better to commit fully and move forward with the operational momentum. One more question, Sarah said, studying Harrison's weathered face. What organization do you two actually work for? Harrison smiled again, but this time the expression carried genuine warmth along with professional secrecy. Let's just say we're people who care about keeping advanced weapons out of the wrong hands. The specifics of our funding and authority are less important than the mission itself. The non-answer was exactly what Sarah had expected. She was being recruited by one of the shadow organizations that operated in the spaces between official agencies, funded by congressional black budgets, and authorized by officials whose names would never appear on any official documentation. Fair enough, Sarah said, accepting that some questions wouldn't be answered until after she'd proven herself worthy of deeper trust. Chun handed her a credit card and a small stack of cash. Elena's expense account. Try not to be too extravagant, but don't let budget concerns compromise operational security. Sarah examined the credit card, noting that it carried Elena Kozlov's name and had clearly been aged to suggest years of regular use. The attention to detail was impressive, suggesting these men had access to resources that went far beyond what most intelligence agencies could provide. Any final questions before we leave? Harrison asked, moving toward the door with the same purposeful efficiency he'd demonstrated throughout their visit. Sarah considered the question seriously, running through the operational checklist that had become second nature during her military service. She had her mission parameters, her cover identity, her timeline, and her support structure. Everything else would have to be improvised based on circumstances she couldn't predict. Just one, Sarah said. After this mission is complete, do I go back to my normal life? Or is this the beginning of a longer relationship? Harrison paused with his hand on the door handle, considering his response carefully. That depends on how you feel about normal life after you've had a chance to be yourself again. The answer suggested that this mission was as much a test as it was an operational necessity. If Sarah performed well, if she found satisfaction in returning to the shadows where her skills had real purpose, then this wouldn't be the last time these men appeared at her door. Understood, Sarah said, and found herself looking forward to the challenge for the first time in months. After Harrison and Chun left, Sarah stood in her empty apartment and felt the familiar weight of preparation settling over her shoulders. Tomorrow, Sarah Mitchell would board a plane to Prague, but Elena Kozlov would be the one who stepped off in a foreign country surrounded by people who killed for money. The transformation would require more than just changing her appearance. She'd need to rediscover the part of herself that could blend into dangerous places and convince dangerous people that she belonged among them. It was a skill set she'd thought she'd left behind with her military service, but apparently some abilities never truly disappeared. Sarah looked around her sparse apartment one more time, seeing it now as the temporary shelter it had always been rather than the foundation of a new life. She'd been trying to force herself into a role that didn't fit, attempting to become someone she wasn't meant to be. Tomorrow, she'd stop pretending and become herself again. The phone rang as she was beginning to plan her transformation into Elena Kozlov, and for a moment Sarah wondered if Harrison and Chun had forgotten to mention some crucial detail about the mission. Instead, she found herself listening to Frank, the bartender from Murphy's Bar. "Hey, Sarah," his gravelly voice came through the speaker. "Hope you don't mind me calling. Got your number from the police report from the other night. Had to file one for insurance purposes." Sarah felt a chill of concern. If there was an official police report about the incident, it could complicate her ability to travel under a false identity. "Is there a problem with the report, Frank?" No, nothing like that," Frank assured her quickly. "Actually, it's the opposite. Those 5 soldiers you tangled with. Turns out they'd been causing problems all over town that night. Bar fights, harassment, the works. Your little demonstration seems to have convinced them to change their behavior permanently." The news was unexpectedly gratifying. Sarah had neutralized an immediate threat to herself, but apparently she'd also solved a larger problem that had been affecting multiple establishments across the city. "I'm glad to hear they learned something from the experience," Sarah said. "More than that," Frank continued. "Word's gotten around about what happened at my place. Other bar owners, restaurant managers, even some shop owners have been calling to thank me for finally putting a stop to those idiots. You're something of a local hero." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she was being praised for actions that had felt like a minor annoyance compared to the missions she'd conducted overseas. But perhaps that was exactly the point. Sometimes the most important battles were fought in ordinary places against ordinary bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted. I was just trying to have a quiet drink, Sarah said, though she found herself smiling at Frank's enthusiasm. Well, you've got a standing invitation to have as many quiet drinks as you want at my place, Frank said. First one's always on the house for someone who stands up to bullies. After ending the call, Sarah realized that she was leaving behind more than just an empty apartment. Frank represented the possibility of building genuine connections in civilian life, of finding purpose in smaller, but no less meaningful ways. The fact that she was walking away from that possibility to return to the shadows said something about who she really was. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the world needed people who were willing to operate in the darkness so others could live in the light. Maybe her struggle with civilian life hadn't been about finding the right job or the right apartment, but about accepting that she was meant for something different. As Sarah began preparing for her transformation into Elena Kozlov, she felt the familiar sense of purpose that had been missing for 3 months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the opportunity to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. For the first time since leaving the Navy, Sarah Mitchell felt like herself again. The Prague airport hummed with the controlled chaos of international travel, but Elena Kozlov moved through the crowds with the predatory grace of someone completely comfortable in hostile territory. Gone was Sarah Mitchell's understated appearance. Elena wore expensive black clothing that suggested both sophistication and danger, her dark hair now cut in a severe style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Colored contacts had changed her eye color from green to gray, and subtle makeup had altered the shape of her features just enough to make facial recognition software unreliable. Elena's posture carried the arrogance of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient violence, while her movements suggested the kind of training that came from military units most people had never heard of. She was Sarah Mitchell's skills wrapped in a package designed to attract exactly the wrong kind of attention from exactly the right kind of people. The Hotel Metamorphosis sat in Prague's old town like a monument to Eastern European excess, its neo-Baroque facade hiding the kind of establishment where arms dealers and war profiteers conducted business behind a veneer of legitimate commerce. Elena's reservation had been arranged through the same shadow networks that connected mercenaries and military contractors across the globe, ensuring that her presence at the upcoming conference would seem both natural and inevitable. Elena's suite overlooked the Vltava River, providing excellent sight lines while maintaining the luxury expected by someone of her supposed reputation. She unpacked with the efficiency of someone accustomed to living out of suitcases, placing her belongings in locations that would allow for rapid departure if circumstances required it. The weapons hidden in her luggage had been crafted by intelligence agencies to appear authentic while remaining undetectable by standard security measures. The conference would officially begin tomorrow, but Elena knew that the real business would be conducted tonight in the hotel's private dining rooms and exclusive bars. Arms dealing was built on personal relationships and mutual trust among people who trusted no one, which meant that reputation and demonstrated competence were more valuable than any amount of money. Elena made her first appearance in the hotel's bar at exactly 8 o'clock, timing her entrance to maximize the number of potential contacts who would witness her arrival. The establishment catered to a very specific clientele, men and women whose expensive clothing couldn't quite hide the predatory instincts that had made them successful in the world's most dangerous profession. The bartender was a woman in her 40s who'd clearly seen enough to remain unimpressed by the dangerous personalities that frequented her establishment. She served Elena a vodka with the kind of professional indifference that suggested she'd learned not to ask questions about her customers' backgrounds. Elena Kozlov, a voice said from behind her, carrying the slight accent that marked its owner as someone from the former Soviet bloc. Your reputation precedes you. Elena turned to find herself facing a man who looked like Central Casting's idea of a Russian arms dealer, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the kind of scars that suggested personal experience with the weapons he sold. His name was Viktor Petrov, and, according to Elena's briefing materials, he'd been trafficking military hardware since the Soviet Union collapsed. Victor, Elena replied, her own accent carrying the crisp efficiency of military training. I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk. Victor's smile revealed teeth that had been expensively repaired after what must have been significant damage. Your work in Chechnya was impressive. Not many people could have extracted that weapons cache from under the noses of federal forces. The compliment referred to one of Elena's fictional achievements, a complex operation that existed only in carefully fabricated reports designed to establish her credibility. Sarah had spent hours memorizing the details, understanding that her life might depend on maintaining the fiction perfectly. The federal forces were more interested in political theater than actual security. Elena replied with the casual arrogance expected from someone who'd successfully operated against state-level opponents. Professional soldiers would have been more challenging. Victor laughed, a sound that carried genuine appreciation for what he perceived as shared competence. You'll find the Prometheus group more professional than most. They're particular about the people they work with. The mention of the Prometheus group sent a chill of anticipation through Sarah's mind, though Elena's expression remained perfectly composed. This was the first confirmation that she was on the right track, that the conference would indeed provide access to her primary target. I'm looking forward to meeting them, Elena said, sipping her vodka while mentally cataloging everything about Victor that might be useful later. Their reputation suggests they understand the difference between amateurs and professionals. A new voice joined the conversation from Elena's left, belonging to a woman whose appearance suggested expensive augmentation designed to maintain youth well beyond its natural limits. The Prometheus group understands many things, she said, her English carrying the precision of someone who'd learned it as a second language but mastered it completely, including the value of discretion. Elena turned to study the newcomer, recognizing her from the intelligence briefings as Anya Volkov, a former GRU officer who'd transitioned to private military contracting after the end of the Cold War. Her specialty was intelligence gathering and interrogation, skills that had made her valuable to organizations that operated outside legal constraints. Anya Volkov, Elena said, extending her hand in a gesture that was perfectly professional while conveying respect for a fellow operator. Your work in the Balkans was masterful. Anya's handshake was firm without being aggressive, the contact of someone confident enough not to need displays of dominance. You flatter me, but I appreciate recognition from someone who understands the complexities of our profession. The three of them formed a loose circle at the bar, their conversation flowing with the easy familiarity of people who shared similar backgrounds and understood the unspoken rules of their profession. To outside observers, they would have appeared to be successful business people discussing legitimate commercial opportunities. The conference tomorrow should be interesting, Victor observed, signaling the bartender for another round. Several new players in the market, some promising technologies becoming available. Elena recognized the casual reference to the stolen NATO hardware without acknowledging it directly. Part of maintaining her cover involved demonstrating the same professional restraint that real arms dealers used when discussing sensitive transactions. New technologies always present interesting opportunities, Elena replied, particularly when they represent significant advances over existing capabilities. Anya's eyes sharpened slightly, suggesting that Elena's response had been noted and filed away for future reference. The Prometheus group has been particularly active in acquiring advanced guidance systems recently. They seem to believe there's significant demand for precision weaponry. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory, but Elena maintained her composed demeanor while mentally recording every detail for future analysis. The stolen NATO hardware included components for advanced missile guidance systems, which meant the Prometheus group was positioning themselves to sell weapons that could turn conventional warheads into precision instruments of destruction. Precision weapons do command premium prices, Elena observed, particularly from clients who value accuracy over raw destructive power. Victor nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of strategic thinking the Prometheus group appreciates. They're always looking for people who understand the broader implications of weapons technology rather than just the immediate tactical applications. Elena felt the subtle shift in the conversation that indicated she was being evaluated for something more than casual professional networking. Victor and Anya weren't just making small talk. They were assessing her suitability for whatever opportunity the Prometheus group represented. I've always believed that the most valuable weapons are those that accomplish their objectives without creating unnecessary collateral damage, Elena said, threading the needle between demonstrating competence and revealing too much about her actual background. Surgical solutions tend to be more profitable than sledgehammer approaches. Anya smiled for the first time since joining the conversation, an expression that somehow managed to be both warm and predatory. You should speak with Marcus tomorrow. He handles recruitment for the Prometheus group, and I think he'd be very interested in your perspective. The introduction Elena had been hoping for was being offered naturally, without the need for manipulation or pressure. Sometimes the best intelligence operations were the ones where targets recruited themselves by recognizing mutual benefit. I'd welcome the opportunity, Elena replied. Professional challenges have been somewhat limited recently. Victor finished his drink and placed the empty glass on the bar with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished his evening's objectives. Marcus will be conducting interviews in the Metamorphosis suite tomorrow afternoon. I'll ensure you receive an invitation. After Victor and Anya moved on to other conversations, Elena remained at the bar, appearing to nurse her vodka while actually conducting reconnaissance on the other conference attendees. The crowd represented a cross-section of the international arms trade, former military officers who'd transitioned to private contracting, intelligence operatives who'd chosen profit over patriotism, and criminal entrepreneurs who'd recognized the lucrative potential of military hardware. Elena identified several faces from her briefing materials, including a former British SAS officer who'd been expelled from the service for selling weapons to IRA cells, and a Chinese intelligence operative who'd been using diplomatic cover to facilitate arms transfers to African conflicts. The presence of such high-level players confirmed that the conference represented more than casual networking. Serious business would be conducted here. The evening progressed with the kind of carefully orchestrated socializing that characterized gatherings of dangerous people who needed to assess each other's trustworthiness before conducting business. Elena moved through the conversations with practiced ease, establishing her credibility while gathering intelligence about the various factions and alliances that shaped the international arms trade. Near midnight, as the formal gathering began to dissolve into smaller, more private discussions, Elena found herself approached by a man who hadn't appeared in any of her briefing materials. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of understated appearance that suggested deliberate effort to avoid attention. His clothes were expensive, but not flashy, his demeanor confident without being aggressive. "Ms. Kozlov," he said, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins, but refined by years of international travel. "I'm Marcus Reed. I understand you might be interested in discussing some exclusive opportunities." Elena felt her pulse quicken slightly, recognizing this as the moment when her cover would be tested most seriously. Marcus Reed was the Prometheus Group's recruitment specialist, the man responsible for identifying and vetting potential operatives for their organization. "Mr. Reed," Elena replied, offering the same professional handshake she'd used with Victor and Anya. "I've heard impressive things about your organization's approach to business." Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained analytical, studying Elena with the intensity of someone trained to identify deception and weakness. "We prefer to work with people who appreciate precision and discretion. Your background suggests you might be such a person." The statement was both a compliment and a test, designed to gauge how Elena would respond to implied scrutiny of her fabricated credentials. Sarah's training kicked in, reminding her that the best lies were built on foundations of truth whenever possible. "I've found that precision and discretion tend to be more profitable than drama and publicity," Elena replied. "Professional solutions to professional problems." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Exactly the perspective we value. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private?" Elena followed Marcus to a quiet corner of the hotel lobby, where they settled into leather chairs that provided privacy while maintaining clear sight lines to all approaches. The positioning was automatic for both of them, the instinctive behavior of people trained to expect threats from any direction. "The Prometheus Group is expanding our operations," Marcus began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to recruiting high-quality personnel. "We're looking for experienced operators who can handle sensitive assignments with minimal supervision." Elena leaned forward slightly, projecting the kind of interest that would be expected from someone seeking new professional opportunities. "What kind of assignments?" "Acquisition and delivery of specialized materials," Marcus replied carefully. "Our clients have very specific requirements, and they're willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed results." The euphemistic language was standard for arms dealing conversations, but Elena understood that Marcus was describing operations to steal and distribute military hardware. The stolen NATO technology was just the beginning of a larger business plan that involved systematically acquiring advanced weapons for sale to the highest bidders. "I've handled similar work in the past," Elena said, drawing on the fictional background that had been crafted to make her an attractive candidate. "Complex acquisitions requiring careful planning and precise execution." Marcus's expression suggested that Elena's response had been exactly what he'd hoped to hear. Our next project involves some particularly sophisticated guidance systems that have become available through unofficial channels. The work would require someone comfortable operating in Eastern Europe for an extended period. Elena felt a surge of excitement as the conversation moved closer to the specific intelligence she'd been sent to gather. The stolen NATO hardware was being stored somewhere in Eastern Europe, and the Prometheus Group was looking for operatives to help distribute it to their clients. Eastern Europe is familiar territory, Elena replied truthfully, since her military service had included multiple assignments in the region. What kind of timeline are we discussing? The initial phase would begin next week, Marcus said, studying Elena's reaction carefully. We'd need someone who could commit to at least 6 weeks of intensive operations. 6 weeks matched the timeline Harrison and Chun had provided, suggesting that Elena's arrival at the conference had been perfectly timed to coincide with the Prometheus Group's recruitment needs. Sometimes intelligence operations succeeded because of careful planning, and sometimes they succeeded because of pure luck. I'm between contracts at the moment, Elena said, which was technically true since her only current contract was with the shadow organization that had recruited her. 6 weeks would be manageable. Marcus smiled more genuinely this time, apparently satisfied with Elena's responses to his preliminary screening. Excellent. There are some additional security protocols we'd need to complete, but I think you'd be an excellent addition to our team. Elena nodded professionally while mentally celebrating the successful penetration of the Prometheus Group's recruitment process. What kind of security protocols? Background verification, skills assessment, psychological evaluation, Marcus replied casually, as if requesting someone's willingness to submit to interrogation was perfectly normal. Standard procedures for anyone handling sensitive materials. The mention of psychological evaluation sent a chill through Sarah's mind, since such assessments were designed to identify deception and hidden motivations. Elena would need to pass tests administered by people trained to detect exactly the kind of operation she was conducting. Of course, Elena replied, maintaining her composed demeanor while calculating the risks involved in deeper penetration of the Prometheus Group. Professional organizations require professional standards. Marcus stood, extending his hand for a final handshake. I'll have someone contact you tomorrow with details about the next steps. Welcome to the Prometheus Group, Ms. Kozlov. After Marcus disappeared back into the hotel's social gathering, Elena remained in her chair, reviewing the evening's intelligence while maintaining her composed exterior. She'd successfully made contact with the Prometheus Group and positioned herself for recruitment, but the real challenges were only beginning. The psychological evaluation would be the most dangerous hurdle, since it would involve trained interrogators attempting to identify any deception in her background or motivations. Elena would need to become her fictional identity so completely that even sophisticated testing would confirm her authenticity. Elena finished her vodka and made her way back to her suite, where she began the psychological preparation that would allow Sarah Mitchell to disappear completely into Elena Kozlov's fabricated personality. The stolen NATO hardware was somewhere in Eastern Europe, probably in a heavily defended compound controlled by experienced military operators. But first, she had to convince a group of professional paranoids that she was exactly who she claimed to be. In the world of covert operations, the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who were supposed to be on your side. Elena studied her reflection in the suite's mirror, seeing a woman who looked nothing like Sarah Mitchell and whose background was entirely fictional. Tomorrow would begin the process of proving that fiction was reality, convincing trained skeptics that Elena Kozlov was real enough to trust with their most sensitive operations. Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 years conducting operations in hostile territory, but Elena Kozlov was about to attempt something far more challenging, convincing experts in deception that her deception was actually truth. The success of the mission, and quite possibly her survival, would depend on her ability to lie so convincingly that she almost believed it herself. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The helicopter cut through the mountain air like a mechanical predator, its rotors beating against the thin atmosphere as it carried Elena deeper into the remote wilderness of Montenegro. 3 days had passed since her successful completion of the Prometheus Group's security protocols, 3 days of intensive psychological evaluation, skills assessment, and background verification that had tested every aspect of her fabricated identity. Elena sat in the helicopter's passenger compartment alongside 2 other new recruits, studying the mountainous terrain that would be her operational environment for the next 6 weeks. The landscape was brutally beautiful, jagged peaks covered in dense forest, deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers, and virtually no sign of human habitation. It was exactly the kind of terrain that made conventional military operations nearly impossible and covert facilities nearly undetectable. The pilot was a former military aviator whose skill at navigating mountain terrain suggested extensive experience in similar operations. He flew without GPS or radio communication, relying on landmark navigation that would leave no electronic trail for intelligence agencies to follow. Elena recognized the professional competence that characterized everything about the Prometheus Group's operations. Sitting across from Elena was a man who'd introduced himself only as Wolf, a former German GSG-9 operator whose expertise in close-quarters combat had impressed even the Prometheus Group's demanding recruiters. He wore the kind of tactical clothing that suggested someone comfortable with violence, and his eyes carried the steady confidence of someone who'd killed professionally and felt no guilt about it. The third recruit was a woman calling herself Phoenix, allegedly a former French intelligence operative who specialized in electronic warfare and communications interception. Her appearance was carefully crafted to seem harmless. She looked like a graduate student or research librarian rather than someone capable of crippling an enemy's command structure with a laptop computer. Elena had been observing her fellow recruits since they'd boarded the helicopter, looking for any signs that they might be intelligence operatives like herself. Both Wolf and Phoenix displayed the kind of professional competence that could indicate either legitimate military background or extremely sophisticated cover identities. The Prometheus Group's recruitment process was designed to attract genuine operators, which meant that Elena might be surrounded by actual criminals rather than fellow intelligence assets. The helicopter began its descent toward what appeared to be empty forest, but as they dropped below the tree line, Elena could see the subtle signs of human construction carefully camouflaged among the natural landscape. Landing platforms had been carved into clearings just large enough to accommodate aircraft, connected by paths that would be invisible from aerial surveillance. The Prometheus Group had built a facility that could house dozens of personnel while remaining completely hidden from conventional detection methods. As the helicopter touched down, Elena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied insertion into hostile territory. For the next 6 weeks, she would be surrounded by people trained to kill efficiently, living in a facility designed to remain hidden from the very agencies that had sent her to find it. One mistake, one inconsistency in her cover identity, and she would simply disappear into the Montenegro wilderness without a trace. The man waiting to greet them on the landing platform looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts of various Special Forces units. He was tall and lean, with graying hair, and the kind of scars that suggested personal experience with explosive devices. His name was Colonel Dmitry Volkov, though whether he'd actually held that rank in any official military was unclear, and he served as the Prometheus Group's field operations commander. "Welcome to Sanctuary," Volkov announced in accented English, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "For the next 6 weeks, this will be your home, your workplace, and quite possibly your grave if you prove unworthy of our trust." The casual mention of death wasn't hyperbole, Elena realized. The Prometheus Group operated in a world where failure meant elimination, and their remote location provided unlimited opportunities for people to simply vanish. Elena would need to prove her value quickly while gathering the intelligence needed to shut down their operations. Volkov led them along carefully maintained paths that wound through the forest toward the main compound. The facility had been constructed with impressive attention to both security and concealment. Buildings were positioned to remain invisible from above, while defensive positions had been carved into the natural landscape in ways that would make assault nearly impossible. "Your first week will involve orientation and skills verification," Volkov explained as they walked. "We need to confirm that your abilities match your reputations before assigning you to operational teams. Those who prove inadequate will be returned to civilization with appropriate compensation for their time." Elena doubted that appropriate compensation meant anything other than a shallow grave, but she maintained Elena Kozlov's confident demeanor while memorizing every detail of the compound's layout. The facility was larger than she'd expected, with multiple buildings connected by underground passages that would allow personnel to move unseen even under aerial surveillance. The main briefing room was located in what appeared to be a natural cave that had been extensively modified with modern technology. Banks of computers lined the walls, connected to satellite communication systems that would allow the Prometheus Group to coordinate operations anywhere in the world. Maps of Eastern Europe covered one wall, marked with symbols that probably indicated weapons storage sites, distribution networks, and potential targets. Your timing is excellent, Volkov continued, gesturing toward a table displaying what Elena recognized as components from advanced missile guidance systems. We've recently acquired some sophisticated hardware that requires careful handling and strategic distribution. Success in this operation could be extremely profitable for everyone involved. Elena studied the displayed components with professional interest, recognizing several items from the NATO hardware that had been stolen 3 weeks earlier. The technology represented years of research and development, the kind of advanced weaponry that could shift the balance of power in any conflict where it was deployed. Impressive hardware, Wolf observed, his German accent becoming more pronounced as his interest increased. These guidance systems could make conventional warheads incredibly precise. Volkov smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully acquired something valuable. Precisely the reason our clients are willing to pay premium prices for access to this technology. The days of area effect weapons are ending. Future conflicts will be decided by precision rather than raw destructive power. Phoenix leaned forward to examine the electronic components more closely, her academic appearance disguising what Elena suspected was genuine expertise in military technology. The integration requirements would be complex, but the targeting capabilities would be extraordinary. Any military force with access to this technology would have a significant advantage. Elena maintained her composed expression while internally cataloging every detail of the displayed hardware. The stolen components were more extensive than the initial intelligence reports had suggested, representing not just guidance systems, but complete targeting packages that could turn ordinary munitions into precision weapons. What kind of distribution network are we discussing? Elena asked, projecting the professional curiosity that Elena Kozlov would be expected to display. Volkov moved to one of the wall maps, pointing to locations marked with red symbols. We've established storage facilities across Eastern Europe, positioned to serve clients in multiple regions. Each location is staffed with personnel capable of handling technical installation and training. The map revealed the scope of the Prometheus Group's operations. They weren't just stealing and selling weapons. They were building a comprehensive infrastructure for distributing advanced military technology to anyone willing to pay their prices. The potential for global destabilization was enormous. Our clients include state actors seeking capability enhancement and non-state organizations looking to level the playing field against superior conventional forces, Volkov continued. The beauty of precision weapons is that they're equally valuable to regular militaries and guerrilla organizations. Elena felt a chill as the implications became clear. The Prometheus Group wasn't just selling weapons. They were selling the capability to conduct surgical strikes that could eliminate specific targets without the massive infrastructure traditionally required for precision warfare. A terrorist organization with access to this technology could assassinate world leaders or destroy critical infrastructure with unprecedented accuracy. What's our role in the distribution process? Wolf asked, his tactical mind clearly already analyzing the operational challenges involved. Security, transport, and technical support, Volkov replied. Our clients don't just want the hardware. They want complete solutions that include installation, training, and ongoing maintenance. You'll be part of teams that ensure successful delivery and implementation. Elena understood that she was being offered the opportunity to participate in operations that would spread advanced weapons technology to some of the world's most dangerous organizations. The intelligence value was enormous, but the moral weight was crushing. Every successful delivery would enhance someone's capability to kill more efficiently. The orientation session continued for several hours, covering operational procedures, security protocols, and the organizational structure that governed life within the Prometheus Group. Elena absorbed every detail while maintaining Elena Kozlov's professional demeanor, building a comprehensive picture of an organization that operated with military efficiency in service of fundamentally criminal objectives. As the session concluded, Volkov announced the team assignments that would govern their activities for the coming weeks. Elena found herself assigned to a unit responsible for establishing a new distribution facility in Romania, working under the command of a man called Viper, whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had apparently impressed the Prometheus Group's leadership. Elena's team would depart in 3 days, giving her time to complete her orientation while gathering additional intelligence about the compound's layout and defensive capabilities. The mission timeline was accelerating, and She would need to find a way to communicate with her handlers before disappearing into another country with a group of professional killers. That evening, Elena sat in the compound's dining facility, sharing a meal with her fellow operatives while listening to conversations that revealed the casual brutality that characterized their profession. These weren't soldiers fighting for their countries or ideals. They were mercenaries who'd chosen profit over principle, selling their skills to anyone willing to pay the right price. The Romanian operation should be interesting, Phoenix observed, her quiet voice carrying undertones that suggested she was looking forward to whatever violence might be involved. I've heard the local authorities can be problematic. Wolf laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Local authorities are only problematic if you're not prepared to deal with them permanently. The Prometheus Group has very effective solutions for political interference. Elena forced herself to nod approvingly while mentally cataloging another piece of intelligence about the organization's willingness to eliminate obstacles through murder. The casual discussion of killing law enforcement officers revealed the depth of criminality that characterized the Prometheus Group's operations. After dinner, Elena returned to her assigned quarters, a small but well-equipped room that provided basic comfort while maintaining the security protocols that governed life in the compound. The walls were thick enough to prevent sound transmission, and Elena suspected they also contained monitoring equipment that would detect any unauthorized communication attempts. Elena began her evening routine with the assumption that everything she did was being observed and recorded. The Prometheus Group's security protocols were too sophisticated to assume privacy, which meant that any intelligence gathering would need to be conducted with extraordinary subtlety. She needed to find a way to communicate with her handlers without revealing her true identity to the surveillance systems that undoubtedly monitored every aspect of life in the compound. The solution came to her as she prepared for sleep, remembering the fitness tracker that Shun had provided during her initial briefing. The device was designed to monitor her vital signs and location, but it also contained a limited communication capability that could be activated through specific biometric patterns. By controlling her heart rate and breathing in precise sequences, Elena could send coded messages that would appear to be natural physiological variations. Elena lay in her narrow bed, focusing on the breathing techniques that would allow her to communicate with her handlers without alerting the compound's security systems. The message she sent was brief but comprehensive: facility located, hardware confirmed, operations expanded beyond initial intelligence, multiple distribution sites established across Eastern Europe. The response came 12 hours later, encoded in the subtle vibrations of the fitness tracker that would feel like normal device feedback to anyone who wasn't expecting coded communication. Her handlers acknowledged receipt of her intelligence and confirmed that plans were being developed for the facility's neutralization. Elena was instructed to continue gathering intelligence while preparing for potential extraction within the next 2 weeks. The timeline was aggressive, but Elena understood the urgency. Every day the Prometheus Group operated meant more advanced weapons being distributed to dangerous organizations around the world. The Romanian mission would provide opportunities to gather additional intelligence about their distribution network, but it would also place Elena deeper in hostile territory with limited options for escape if her cover was compromised. Elena's final day at the Montenegro compound was spent in advanced training sessions designed to ensure that all operatives understood the technical requirements for handling and installing the stolen guidance systems. The instruction was conducted by genuine experts, former military engineers who'd been recruited by the Prometheus Group for their specialized knowledge. Elena absorbed the technical training while analyzing the compound's daily routines for weaknesses that could be exploited during extraction. The facility's isolation provided excellent security against external threats, but it also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone with inside knowledge of their procedures. The departure for Romania was scheduled for dawn, allowing the transport helicopter to cross international borders under cover of darkness. Elena packed her equipment with the same care she'd used during her military service, understanding that the next phase of the mission would test every aspect of her training and preparation. As Elena Kozlov prepared to leave Sanctuary with a team of professional killers, Sarah Mitchell calculated the odds of survival and successful mission completion. The intelligence she'd gathered was already valuable enough to justify the operation, but the Romanian mission would provide opportunities to identify and potentially neutralize the entire Prometheus Group distribution network. The helicopter lifted off just as the first light of dawn began to penetrate the mountain valleys, carrying Elena toward whatever dangers awaited in Romania. She'd successfully infiltrated one of the world's most sophisticated criminal organizations, gathered intelligence that could save countless lives, and positioned herself to strike at the heart of an international weapons trafficking network. But the most dangerous part of the mission was only beginning. Elena would soon be operating in foreign territory with people who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her true identity. Success would require perfect execution of every aspect of her cover identity while gathering the final intelligence needed to bring down the Prometheus group permanently. Elena watched the Montenegro mountains disappear below the helicopter and felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling over her shoulders. Sarah Mitchell had been a decorated Navy SEAL, but Elena Kozlov was about to attempt something that would test every skill she'd learned in 3 years of the world's most dangerous assignments. The game had reached its most critical phase, and the stakes had never been higher. The warehouse in Bucharest crouched against the industrial skyline like a sleeping giant, its corrugated metal walls reflecting the gray morning light as Elena and her team conducted their final reconnaissance of what would become the Prometheus Group's newest distribution hub. 2 weeks had passed since leaving Montenegro, 2 weeks of establishing operational procedures and building relationships with local contacts who could facilitate the movement of weapons across Eastern Europe. Elena had excelled in her role as Elena Kozlov, demonstrating the kind of professional competence that earned respect from even the most paranoid members of Viper's team. Her military background, filtered through the fictional lens of Spetsnaz training, provided credible explanations for skills that might otherwise have raised suspicions about her true identity. Viper himself was a man who embodied the ruthless efficiency that characterized the Prometheus Group's operations. Tall and lean with prematurely gray hair, he moved through the Romanian underworld with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through sufficient application of violence. His real name was classified information that Elena had been unable to discover, but his reputation for eliminating obstacles suggested a background in special operations or intelligence work. The team consisted of 6 operatives including Elena, each bringing specialized skills to the complex task of establishing a secure weapons distribution facility in hostile territory. Wolf handled security arrangements with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent years protecting high-value targets. Phoenix managed communications and electronic surveillance, her academic appearance disguising expertise in systems that could monitor law enforcement activities across multiple countries. Elena's role focused on logistics and coordination, responsibilities that provided access to information about the Prometheus Group's entire Romanian operation while maintaining her cover as a valuable team member. She'd spent 2 weeks building detailed intelligence about their supply chains, storage procedures, and distribution networks, information that would prove invaluable when authorities finally moved to shut down their operations. The warehouse itself was perfectly positioned for their needs. Located in an industrial district where unusual activity would attract minimal attention, with multiple access routes that would allow rapid evacuation if law enforcement became problematic. Underground storage areas had been excavated beneath the building's foundation, creating secure spaces for housing weapons that would be completely invisible to aerial surveillance. Final security sweep in 30 minutes, Viper announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. We'll begin inventory transfer tonight, so I want every system tested and confirmed operational. Elena nodded professionally while mentally preparing for the most dangerous phase of her mission. Tonight, the stolen NATO hardware would be moved from temporary storage locations to the warehouse, providing her with the opportunity to gather final intelligence about the Prometheus Group's distribution network. But it would also be her last chance to communicate with her handlers before the facility became fully operational. The security sweep revealed the sophisticated measures the Prometheus Group had implemented to protect their investment. Motion detectors covered every approach to the warehouse, while thermal imaging systems would detect intruders even in complete darkness. The underground storage areas were equipped with biometric access controls that would prevent unauthorized entry even by team members who lacked appropriate clearance. Elena studied the security arrangements with professional appreciation while identifying weaknesses that could be exploited during extraction. The same measures designed to keep intruders out would also prevent escape if her true identity was discovered, which meant that timing would be critical for any rescue attempt. As evening approached, Elena found herself assigned to oversee the arrival of transport vehicles carrying the first shipment of weapons from Montenegro. The convoy consisted of 3 unmarked trucks escorted by security personnel who looked like they'd been recruited from various European Special Forces units. Their professionalism was impressive, but Elena recognized the subtle signs that suggested they were mercenaries rather than soldiers. The absence of unit cohesion, the focus on individual rather than collective security, the willingness to work for anyone willing to pay their rates. The unloading process revealed the scope of hardware the Prometheus Group had acquired through their theft of NATO technology. In addition to the guidance systems Elena had seen in Montenegro, the shipment included advanced targeting computers, encrypted communication equipment, and technical manuals that would allow relatively inexperienced operators to integrate sophisticated weapons into existing military platforms. Elena maintained her professional demeanor while internally calculating the devastating potential represented by the weapons being stored beneath the warehouse. A terrorist organization with access to this technology could conduct surgical strikes against specific targets with unprecedented precision, while state actors could enhance their military capabilities without the decades of research and development traditionally required for advanced weapons systems. Impressive inventory, Wolf observed, his German accent becoming more pronounced as his excitement increased. These systems could revolutionize asymmetric warfare. Phoenix was examining the communication equipment with the focused intensity of someone who understood its true capabilities. The encryption protocols are military-grade, she said quietly. Any organization with access to this technology would have secure communications that intelligence agencies couldn't penetrate. Elena forced herself to nod approvingly, while fighting the revulsion that came from watching weapons that should have protected NATO forces being prepared for sale to their enemies. The stolen technology represented years of Allied research and development, paid for by taxpayers who believed their investments would enhance their security rather than threaten it. Viper approached Elena as the final containers were being moved into the underground storage areas, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully completed a complex logistical operation. "Excellent work coordinating the arrival schedule," he said. "Your organizational skills are exactly what we need for the distribution phase." The compliment was both gratifying and terrifying. Elena's success at playing her role was positioning her for deeper involvement in operations that would spread advanced weapons technology across the globe. Each successful mission would enhance her value to the Prometheus Group while contributing to their criminal objectives. "Thank you," Elena replied. "I'm looking forward to the distribution phase. It should present some interesting challenges." Viper's smile suggested he appreciated Elena's enthusiasm for what he perceived as shared criminal enterprise. "The first shipments are scheduled for next week. We've got buyers lined up in 3 countries, including some organizations that could become very profitable long-term clients." Elena felt her stomach tighten as the implications became clear. Within days, the stolen NATO technology would begin flowing to terrorist organizations, rogue states, and criminal enterprises that would use advanced weapons to pursue their own violent objectives. Every successful delivery would result in more sophisticated capabilities in the hands of people who had no qualms about killing innocents to achieve their goals. That night, Elena lay in her assigned quarters in a Bucharest hotel, using her fitness tracker to send what she knew would be her final intelligence update before the extraction operation began. The message was comprehensive but coded. Warehouse location confirmed, complete inventory cataloged, first distribution scheduled within 72 hours, recommend immediate action. The response came within hours, encoded in the device's normal operational patterns but carrying information that sent adrenaline surging through Elena's system. Extraction authorized, special operations team deploying, maintain position and await signal. Operation will commence at 0300 hours. Elena's final day as a member of the Prometheus Group began with a security briefing that revealed their awareness of potential law enforcement interest in their operations. Viper had received intelligence suggesting that Romanian authorities were investigating unusual activity in the industrial district, though they apparently hadn't identified the warehouse as a specific target. "Standard precautions," Viper announced to the assembled team. "We'll maintain elevated security protocols until the first shipments are completed. After that, we'll evaluate whether this location remains viable for long-term operations." Elena nodded along with her teammates while calculating the timing of the extraction operation her handlers had planned. 0300 hours was less than 18 hours away, which meant she needed to position herself to assist whatever special operations team was being deployed to neutralize the Prometheus Group's Romanian facility. The day progressed with final preparations for the distribution phase that would begin tomorrow night. Elena participated in planning sessions that revealed the extent of the Prometheus Group's criminal network. They'd established relationships with arms dealers across Eastern Europe, created supply chains that could move weapons across multiple international borders, and developed customer relationships with organizations that most governments classified as terrorist entities. Elena memorized every detail while maintaining Elena Kozlov's professional enthusiasm for what appeared to be a lucrative criminal enterprise. The intelligence she'd gathered over the past 3 weeks would allow authorities to dismantle not just the Romanian operation, but potentially the entire Prometheus Group network that threatened global security. As evening approached, Elena volunteered for the night security shift that would position her perfectly for the extraction operation. Viper accepted her offer with the gratitude of someone who appreciated team members willing to handle unpleasant duties, apparently interpreting her volunteering as evidence of her commitment to the organization. Elena took her position in the warehouse's security center at 11 o'clock, surrounded by monitors that displayed feeds from cameras positioned around the entire facility. Her assignment was to watch for any sign of law enforcement surveillance while her teammates slept in preparation for tomorrow's distribution activities. At precisely 0300 hours, Elena's earpiece crackled with a voice she recognized as belonging to Agent Chun from her initial recruitment meeting. Mockingbird, this is Control. Package delivery commencing in 60 seconds. Confirm your position. Elena keyed her microphone once for confirmation, using the simple signal protocol she'd learned during her SEAL training. The Prometheus Group's communication procedures didn't include monitoring internal security frequencies, which meant her response wouldn't be detected by their surveillance systems. Exactly 60 seconds later, the warehouse's power systems failed with a sudden silence that marked the beginning of the most sophisticated special operations raid Elena had ever witnessed. Emergency lighting activated automatically, bathing the facility in red illumination that would actually assist the attacking team's night vision equipment. Elena moved immediately to the security center's emergency protocols, appearing to respond to the power failure while actually disabling the backup systems that would have restored normal lighting within minutes. To anyone watching the security monitors, she would appear to be following proper procedures while actually facilitating the raid she'd helped plan. The first indication that the warehouse was under assault came from Wolf, whose voice echoed through the facility's communication system. Contact. Multiple hostiles approaching from the north perimeter. Elena could hear the distinctive sound of suppressed weapons fire echoing through the building's corridors, along with the controlled explosions that indicated the attacking team was systematically breaching the Prometheus Group's defensive positions. The raid was being conducted with military precision by personnel who clearly understood both the facility's layout and their opponent's capabilities. Viper's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding personnel under fire. All units to defensive positions. Phoenix, I want external communications restored immediately. Elena continued her performance as a loyal team member, appearing to coordinate defensive responses while actually monitoring the attacking team's progress through the security camera feeds. The raiders were clearly special operations personnel. Their movements displayed the kind of coordinated precision that could only come from extensive training and realistic experience. The battle for the warehouse lasted exactly 17 minutes, though it felt like hours to Elena as she balanced her role as a Prometheus Group operative with her desire to see the criminal organization destroyed. The attacking team moved through the facility with methodical efficiency, neutralizing defensive positions while securing the stolen weapons that represented the primary objective of their mission. Viper made his final stand in the underground storage areas, surrounded by the advanced weapons technology that had made the Prometheus Group so dangerous. Elena watched through the security monitors as he attempted to destroy the evidence of their operations, only to be stopped by raiders who understood exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. The arrest of Elena Kozlov was conducted with professional courtesy by Agent Chun, who appeared to be disappointed that such a promising operative had chosen to work for a criminal organization. Elena played her role perfectly, expressing shock and outrage at what she claimed was an unprovoked assault by government forces on legitimate business activities. Elena Kozlov, you're under arrest for trafficking in stolen military hardware, Chun announced formally, though his tone carried undertones that suggested he was enjoying the performance. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right. Elena maintained her indignant protests until she was securely restrained and removed from the warehouse, at which point she allowed herself a small smile that acknowledged the successful completion of a mission that had tested every aspect of her training and preparation. The Prometheus Group's Romanian operation had been completely neutralized, and the intelligence she'd gathered would allow authorities to shut down their entire network. 3 hours later, Elena sat in a secured debriefing facility outside Bucharest, no longer the dangerous arms dealer Elena Kozlov, but, once again, Sarah Mitchell, former Navy SEAL and current intelligence operative for an organization that preferred to remain unnamed. The transformation back to her true identity felt almost as dramatic as the original change had been weeks earlier. Director Harrison looked exactly as he had during their first meeting, though his expression carried the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully managed a complex operation with minimal casualties and maximum intelligence value. Agent Chen reviewed files that contained comprehensive documentation of the Prometheus Group's activities, evidence that would be used to prosecute surviving members and prevent future operations. Outstanding work, Harrison said, his voice carrying genuine respect for what Sarah had accomplished. The intelligence you gathered has already led to raids on Prometheus Group facilities in 4 countries. We estimate you've prevented the distribution of advanced weapons that could have killed thousands of people. Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that came from successful completion of a mission that had protected innocent people from dangerous enemies. The months of civilian life that had felt so meaningless now seemed like preparation for exactly this kind of operation, using her skills to protect people who would never know they'd been in danger. What happens to the surviving Prometheus Group members? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Chen closed his files with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully documented a major criminal enterprise. Viper and 3 of his operatives are in custody and will face trial for weapons trafficking and conspiracy charges. The others didn't survive the arrest process. They chose to resist rather than surrender. Sarah nodded, understanding that Wolf and Phoenix had made the same choice that many operators made when faced with capture by hostile forces. The Prometheus Group had recruited people who'd rather die than face interrogation about their criminal activities. And the stolen NATO technology? Sarah asked. Completely recovered, Harrison replied. Every piece of hardware has been accounted for and will be returned to appropriate authorities. The guidance systems will be back in friendly hands within 48 hours. The successful recovery of the stolen weapons was gratifying, but Sarah knew that the real value of the operation lay in the destruction of the network that could have distributed similar technology in the future. The Prometheus Group had represented a new kind of threat, professional military operators selling advanced capabilities to anyone willing to pay the right price. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. Which brings us to the question of what happens next. Your performance on this mission was exceptional, and there are other operations that would benefit from your particular combination of skills and experience. Sarah had been expecting this conversation since she'd accepted the original mission, understanding that success would lead to offers of permanent employment with whatever organization Harrison and Chen represented. The prospect was both exciting and terrifying. Returning to the world of covert operations meant abandoning any hope of normal civilian life. What kind of operations? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer would determine her response. Chen opened a new folder containing photographs and intelligence reports that Sarah recognized as targeting packages for future missions. International arms trafficking, terrorist financing, cyber warfare, industrial espionage. Threats that require responses from people who can operate outside normal legal constraints. Sarah studied the materials while considering the choice she was being offered. She could return to civilian life with the knowledge that she'd served her country one final time, or she could embrace the reality that some people were meant to work in the shadows where normal rules didn't apply. The decision was easier than she'd expected. The months of trying to force herself into civilian life had been among the most miserable of her existence, while the past 3 weeks operating as Elena Kozlov had reminded her of who she really was beneath the surface. Some people were meant for normal lives, but Sarah Mitchell was meant for something different. When do I start? Sarah said, finally, accepting what she'd probably known since the moment Harrison and Chen had appeared at her apartment door. Harrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully recruited exactly the right person for an impossible job. Welcome to the team, Agent Mitchell. Your first briefing is tomorrow morning, and I think you're going to find the next mission even more challenging than infiltrating the Prometheus Group. Sarah felt the familiar weight of operational responsibility settling over her shoulders, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of rightness that had been missing during her civilian life. She wasn't Sarah Mitchell trying to pretend she was normal. She was Sarah Mitchell accepting that normal was never going to be enough. The transition from Navy SEAL to civilian had been the most difficult challenge of her life, but the transition from civilian to intelligence operative felt like coming home. There would be other missions, other identities, other chances to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. Frank's Bar seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime, though Sarah knew that the lessons she'd learned there about standing up to bullies would serve her well in whatever assignments lay ahead. Some fights were worth having, whether they took place in dive bars or international criminal enterprises. As Sarah prepared to leave the debriefing facility and begin whatever came next, she reflected on the strange path that had led from that rainy night in Murphy's Bar to the successful destruction of an international weapons trafficking network. 5 drunk soldiers had thought they'd cornered an easy target, only to discover they were facing someone whose training went far beyond anything they'd imagined. The Prometheus group had made a similar mistake, believing they were recruiting Elena Kozlov when they were actually opening their organization to Sarah Mitchell. In both cases, the outcome had been determined by the fundamental truth that some people were exactly who they appeared to be, while others carried capabilities that remained hidden until the moment they were truly needed. Sarah Mitchell had spent 3 years as a Navy SEAL, 3 months as a struggling civilian, and 3 weeks as an arms dealer named Elena Kozlov. Tomorrow, she would become someone else entirely, carrying her skills into new shadows in service of missions that would probably never make the evening news. But tonight, she was exactly who she'd always been, someone who stood up to bullies, no matter how sophisticated their organization or how advanced their weapons. The fight continued, and Sarah Mitchell was finally where she belonged.